Hello everyone and welcome to IB ESS lecture series. In this lesson, we'll explore one of the most important concepts, feedback mechanisms. By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to distinguish between positive and negative feedback, explain how they influence environmental systems, and apply these concepts to real-world examples such as climate change, population dynamics, and ecosystem stability. At the end of this lecture, you will find IB ESS exam questions for your practice. Before we begin, let's look at what you'll achieve in this lesson. By the end of this lecture, you'll be able to define feedback mechanisms and distinguish between positive and negative feedback. We'll explore real-world examples, such as the ice albedo effect, where melting ice accelerates warming, and predator-prey interactions, where populations naturally regulate each other. You'll also analyze how feedback mechanisms influence system stability, interpret environmental models and diagrams, and evaluate why understanding feedback is essential for predicting environmental change and making informed decisions for sustainability. Environmental systems respond to change through two main types of feedback loops. Negative feedback opposes change, helping a system return to equilibrium and maintain stability. For example, when our body temperature rises, sweating cools the body, and in ecosystems, limited resources slow population growth. In contrast, positive feedback reinforces change, pushing the system further from equilibrium. A classic environmental example is the ice albedo effect. As ice melts, darker surfaces absorb more sunlight, causing even more warming and further ice loss. Understanding the difference between these two feedback loops is essential for explaining how environmental systems remain stable or undergo rapid change. Let's explore negative feedback loops, which help keep environmental systems stable by reducing change and restoring equilibrium. The process begins with a disturbance, such as an increase in body temperature above 37 degrees Celsius. Receptors detect the change. The control center, the hypothalamus, processes the information, and effectors trigger sweating and dilation of blood vessels. These responses cool the body and return it to its normal set point. Similar mechanisms occur in nature. For example, rising atmospheric carbon dioxide can stimulate plant growth, increasing carbon uptake and helping reduce carbon dioxide levels. Negative feedback loops are essential because they maintain stability and resilience in both biological and environmental systems. Now let's examine the Daisy World model, developed by James Lovelock and Andrew Watson, which demonstrates how negative feedback mechanisms can regulate a planet's climate. This simplified model represents a planet containing black ground, white daisies, and black daisies. White daisies have a high albedo, so they reflect more incoming solar radiation and cool the surface, whereas black daisies have a low albedo, absorbing more solar energy and increasing surface temperature. The sequence begins when solar radiation increases, causing the planet to warm. Warmer conditions favor the growth of white daisies. As their population expands, the planet's overall albedo increases, reflecting more sunlight back into space. Consequently, less heat is absorbed, temperatures decrease toward the optimum range, and climatic equilibrium is restored. This is a classic example of a negative feedback loop, where the response counteracts the original disturbance. The graphical comparison reinforces this concept. A planet with daisies maintains a relatively stable temperature across a wide range of solar inputs because biological processes regulate the environment. In contrast, a planet without life lacks this regulatory mechanism, so even small changes in solar radiation produce large temperature fluctuations. The key message is that interactions between living organisms and the physical environment can create self-regulating systems. A real-world example is Earth's forests, which absorb atmospheric carbon dioxide through photosynthesis, helping moderate climate change. The Daisy World model therefore provides a simple but powerful illustration of ecosystem resilience and the principles underlying the Gaia hypothesis. Let's apply the concept of negative feedback to a natural ecosystem using the classic lynx, snowshoe-hare predator-prey relationship. The process begins when the hare population increases, providing more food for lynx. As food becomes abundant, the lynx population also increases because more individuals survive and reproduce. With more predators hunting, the hare population declines. As hare numbers decrease, food becomes limited for lynx, causing the lynx population to decline as well. With fewer predators, the hare population gradually recovers, restoring ecological balance. This continuous cycle is a negative feedback loop because each response reduces the original change and keeps both populations within sustainable limits. If this feedback mechanism is disrupted, for example, if humans remove too many lynx, the hare population may grow uncontrollably, leading to overgrazing, habitat degradation, soil erosion, and reduced biodiversity. Similar negative feedback mechanisms operate in grazing ecosystems, coral reefs, and forest nutrient cycles. The key takeaway is that negative feedback maintains ecosystem stability, resilience, and biodiversity by preventing uncontrolled population growth or decline. Let's examine blood glucose regulation, a classic example of a negative feedback loop that maintains homeostasis in the human body. The process begins after a meal, when blood glucose levels rise above the normal range of approximately 4 to 6 millimoles per liter. The pancreas detects this increase and responds by releasing the hormone insulin. Insulin stimulates body cells to absorb glucose and encourages the liver and muscles to store excess glucose as glycogen. As glucose is removed from the bloodstream, blood sugar levels gradually return to the normal set point. Once normal levels are restored, insulin secretion decreases, preventing blood glucose from falling too low. This is a negative feedback mechanism because the response opposes the initial change and restores balance. Similar feedback mechanisms regulate body temperature through sweating and shivering, blood pressure, blood calcium concentration, and water balance in the kidneys, ensuring stable internal conditions despite continuous external changes. Body temperature regulation, one of the best examples of a negative feedback mechanism maintaining homeostasis. The process begins when body temperature rises above its normal set point of approximately 36.5 to 37.5 degrees Celsius, such as after vigorous exercise or during hot weather. Thermoreceptors located in the skin and the hypothalamus detect this increase and send signals to the brain's control center. The hypothalamus responds by activating the sweat glands and causing blood vessels in the skin to dilate. As sweat evaporates and more blood flows near the skin surface, heat is lost to the environment, reducing body temperature. Once the temperature returns to the normal range, sweating decreases and blood vessels return to their usual diameter, restoring homeostasis. This response opposes the original change, making it a classic negative feedback loop. Similar feedback mechanisms regulate blood glucose levels, blood pressure, calcium concentration, and water balance in the kidneys, ensuring that the body's internal environment remains stable despite changing external conditions. During positive feedback, where a response reinforces the original change, causing the system to move further away from equilibrium. The process begins with a disturbance, such as favorable environmental conditions that increase a population. Instead of reducing this change, the system responds by amplifying it. As the population grows, more individuals reproduce, leading to an even larger population. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle in which each increase produces an even greater increase, driving the system further from its original stable state. The rabbit population example clearly illustrates this process. A few rabbits colonize an area with abundant food, water, and shelter. High resource availability improves survival and reproduction, producing more offspring. As the population expands, the number of breeding individuals also increases, accelerating population growth. Unless limiting factors such as food shortages, disease, or predation intervene, the population may exceed the environment's carrying capacity. Similar positive feedback occurs during algal blooms in nutrient-rich lakes, where rapid algal growth further degrades water quality. The key takeaway is that positive feedback amplifies disturbances, promotes rapid change, and can destabilize environmental systems. A population growth as an example of a positive feedback loop. Positive feedback occurs when a change triggers responses that reinforce the original change, causing the system to move further away from equilibrium. The process begins when a population increases because of favorable conditions such as abundant food, water, and shelter. Since resources are still plentiful, survival rates remain high and individuals reproduce successfully. The larger population then produces even more offspring, leading to accelerated population growth. As the number of breeding individuals continues to increase, the potential for further growth also increases, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. The result is a rapidly expanding population that continues growing until limiting factors, such as food shortages, disease, predation, or lack of space, begin to act. The rabbit population illustrates this concept clearly, but similar positive feedback occurs in bacterial cultures, where rapid cell division leads to exponential growth, and with invasive species, which spread quickly in new habitats when natural predators are absent. The key takeaway is that positive feedback amplifies change, promotes rapid growth, and can destabilize environmental systems if no limiting factors intervene. Blood clotting is one of the most familiar examples of a positive feedback loop. The process begins when a blood vessel is injured, causing bleeding. Platelets immediately adhere to the damaged tissue and release signaling chemicals, such as ATP and thromboxane, which attract and activate additional platelets. As more platelets arrive, they release even more signaling molecules, recruiting yet more platelets to the injury site. This self-reinforcing cycle rapidly enlarges the platelet plug until a stable blood clot forms, sealing the wound and stopping blood loss. Unlike negative feedback, this response amplifies the original change rather than reversing it. The positive feedback loop continues only until the wound is sealed, after which normal regulatory mechanisms terminate the process. Similar positive feedback occurs during childbirth, where the hormone oxytocin strengthens uterine contractions and stronger contractions stimulate the release of even more oxytocin until delivery is complete. This example demonstrates that positive feedback is essential when a rapid and decisive biological response is required. Let's now connect positive feedback loops with the concept of a tipping point. Positive feedback continuously amplifies an initial disturbance, making the system progressively less stable. The process begins with a small change, which triggers responses that reinforce the original disturbance. As the change grows stronger, the system approaches a tipping point, the critical threshold beyond which recovery becomes difficult or impossible. Once this threshold is crossed, the system rapidly shifts to a new equilibrium, often with very different characteristics. The graph illustrates this transition. Initially, the system remains stable despite small disturbances. Positive feedback gradually amplifies the change until the tipping point is reached. Beyond this point, the system undergoes a rapid transition before settling into a new stable state. A real-world example is the melting of Arctic sea ice. As ice melts, less sunlight is reflected and more heat is absorbed by the darker ocean surface. This accelerates further melting, and if enough ice is lost, the Arctic climate may shift to a new state with much less permanent sea ice. The key takeaway is that positive feedback can push environmental systems beyond critical thresholds, leading to rapid and sometimes irreversible changes. Let's see some important environmental examples of positive feedback loops that can drive ecosystems toward tipping points. A tipping point is a critical threshold beyond which a system rapidly shifts into a new stable state. In melting ice sheets, rising temperatures melt ice, reducing Earth's albedo. Darker ocean surfaces absorb more solar energy, accelerating further melting. In forest fires, warmer and drier conditions increase fire frequency, releasing large amounts of carbon dioxide that intensify global warming. Coral reef collapse begins as warmer oceans cause coral bleaching. As corals lose their symbiotic algae, reef health declines, making recovery increasingly difficult. In algal blooms, excess nutrients stimulate rapid algal growth. When algae die and decompose, more nutrients are released while oxygen is depleted, promoting additional blooms and damaging aquatic ecosystems. The overall pattern is the same in every example. A small disturbance is amplified by positive feedback, the system approaches a tipping point, and once that threshold is crossed, it shifts to a new equilibrium that may be difficult or impossible to reverse. Understanding these feedbacks is essential for predicting environmental change and developing effective conservation and climate management strategies. Let's explore how tipping points can lead to regime shifts in environmental systems. A system may remain stable despite small disturbances, existing in what we call stable state A. However, a small alteration, such as nutrient pollution, deforestation, or rising temperature, can be amplified by positive feedback. Once the disturbance exceeds a critical tipping point, the system rapidly undergoes a regime shift and settles into a different stable condition, known as stable state B. Although the system is stable again, it now functions very differently from its original state. The conceptual landscape illustrates this idea using two valleys, each representing a stable equilibrium. A system naturally remains within one valley, resisting minor disturbances. However, if enough force pushes it over the ridge, the tipping point, it rolls into another valley and stabilizes in a new state. A classic example is a clear freshwater lake becoming a turbid, algae-dominated lake after excessive nutrient input. The key message is that small environmental changes can trigger large, sometimes irreversible, shifts in ecosystem structure and function once critical thresholds are crossed. Let's examine 4 real-world examples of tipping points and regime shifts in environmental systems. In melting ice sheets, gradual warming reduces ice cover, lowering Earth's albedo so more solar energy is absorbed. Once the tipping point is reached, ice loss accelerates, shifting the system to a new state with much less permanent ice. In coral reefs, increasing ocean temperatures, pollution, and overfishing stress corals until they can no longer recover. The reef then shifts from a coral-dominated ecosystem to one dominated by algae, with a major loss of biodiversity. In forest ecosystems, repeated droughts, heat waves, and wildfires eventually exceed the forest's ability to regenerate, leading to a regime shift from dense forest to degraded shrubland or grassland. In lake eutrophication, excess nitrogen and phosphorus stimulate algal growth. Persistent algal blooms reduce water clarity and oxygen levels, transforming a clear water lake into a turbid, algae-dominated ecosystem. These examples demonstrate a common pattern. A small environmental change is amplified by positive feedback, a tipping point is crossed, and the system settles into a new stable state that is often difficult to reverse. To understand environmental systems effectively, we rely on models, which are simplified representations of real-world systems. Models help us explain how systems function, predict future outcomes, and analyze interactions between different components. For example, climate models are used to forecast future temperature changes, while population models predict the growth of species over time. A real ecosystem contains countless organisms and interactions, making it difficult to study directly. A model simplifies this complexity by focusing on the essential relationships, such as the flow of energy from plants to animals and decomposers. Environmental scientists use different types of models, including physical models, such as a globe representing Earth, conceptual models, like food webs and feedback diagrams, mathematical models, which use equations to describe population growth, computer models for climate and weather simulations, and graphical models to display trends such as temperature or population change. A good model should be simple, relevant, accurate, useful, and testable. However, every model has limitations because it simplifies reality and may omit some details. The key takeaway is that models are indispensable tools for understanding, predicting, and managing complex environmental systems while recognizing that no model can perfectly represent the real world. Understanding how models work is essential because they allow us to study complex environmental systems in a simplified way. A model focuses on the most important components and relationships, removing unnecessary details while retaining the features needed to explain and predict system behavior. The modeling process begins by observing the real system and collecting reliable data. Scientists then build a simplified model using key variables and interactions. Next, they test the model under different scenarios, asking what-if questions to evaluate possible outcomes. The results help us understand system behavior, identify patterns and cause and effect relationships, and predict future responses. As new observations become available, the model is refined to improve its accuracy. Models are used in many areas of environmental science. Climate models predict future temperature and rainfall patterns. Population models estimate changes in species numbers. Predator-prey models explain interactions between organisms, and epidemiological models forecast disease spread. The key message is that models are dynamic scientific tools that improve with new evidence, enabling better environmental decision-making and more reliable predictions. Environmental models can be presented in several forms, with each form designed to answer different scientific questions. A model is a simplified representation of reality that helps us understand how systems operate and predict how they may respond to change. Models may be expressed as graphs, which display trends such as population growth over time. Diagrams, such as food webs that illustrate energy flow between producers, consumers, and decomposers. Equations, like the logistic growth equation used to calculate population dynamics. Computer simulations, which predict future forest growth or climate change under different scenarios, and written descriptions, which explain processes such as lake eutrophication or ecological succession. Different forms are used because different audiences and research questions require different approaches. For example, policymakers may prefer graphs and simulations, while scientists often rely on equations and conceptual diagrams. The key takeaway is that no single model is sufficient on its own. Using multiple forms provides a more complete understanding of environmental systems and improves our ability to explain, predict, and manage environmental change. Models play a vital role in environmental systems and societies because they help scientists understand complex systems and make evidence-based decisions. One important application is predicting climate change, where climate models simulate Earth's atmosphere to forecast temperature rise, sea level rise, and extreme weather, supporting mitigation and adaptation strategies. Models are also essential for managing natural resources by estimating water availability, planning sustainable forestry, and balancing resource demand with supply. In ecosystem studies, models simulate interactions among producers, consumers, decomposers, and the environment, helping us predict how the loss of one species can affect an entire food web. Another key application is tracking pollution, where air and water quality models predict how pollutants disperse, identify high-risk areas, and guide pollution control measures. For example, atmospheric models can forecast the movement of smoke from wildfires or industrial emissions. Overall, environmental models improve scientific predictions, support sustainable resource management, reduce costs by testing scenarios before implementation, protect ecosystems and human health, and provide a strong scientific foundation for environmental planning, policy, and education. Although models are powerful scientific tools, they are not perfect, and understanding their limitations is essential in environmental systems and societies. First, models oversimplify reality by focusing only on the most important components while leaving out many details. For example, a climate model cannot include every cloud, tree, or human activity on Earth. Second, models depend on assumptions. A population growth model may assume constant birth and death rates, but in reality, disease outbreaks, migration, or resource shortages can change these rates and produce different outcomes. Third, all models contain uncertainty because they rely on estimates and incomplete data. Weather forecasts, for instance, may predict a range of temperatures rather than an exact value because natural systems are highly complex and constantly changing. Recognizing these limitations allows scientists to interpret model results carefully, compare different models, make better environmental decisions, and continuously improve model accuracy. A good example is flood prediction. If a model does not include unusually intense rainfall or blocked drainage systems, it may underestimate flood risk. The key message is that models are valuable guides for understanding and predicting environmental systems, but their results should always be interpreted with an awareness of their assumptions and uncertainties. Environmental scientists use different types of models because no single model can answer every question. Physical models are tangible, three-dimensional replicas of real systems. For example, a volcano model or a globe helps us visualize structure and understand how a system looks or functions. Conceptual models use diagrams to show relationships between components. A food web, for instance, illustrates how producers, consumers, and decomposers interact within an ecosystem. Mathematical models represent systems using equations and numbers. An example is the logistic population growth equation, which predicts how a population changes as it approaches its carrying capacity. Computer models simulate complex systems over time. Climate models combine atmospheric, oceanic, and land data to project future climate scenarios under different greenhouse gas emissions. Statistical models analyze data to identify trends and make predictions. For example, regression analysis can reveal how increasing temperature influences ice cream sales or crop yields. Finally, graphical models present information visually through graphs, charts, or maps. Topographic maps, climate graphs, and pollution maps help scientists recognize spatial patterns and compare environmental data. Together, these complementary models improve our understanding, prediction, and management of environmental systems. Climate models are simplified representations of Earth's climate system that help scientists understand how the climate functions and predict how it may respond to future changes. The process begins by collecting input data, including observations of temperature, atmospheric carbon dioxide, ocean conditions, ice cover, and land characteristics. These data are then used to represent the Earth in a three-dimensional grid, where mathematical equations based on physics, chemistry, and biology calculate how energy, water, and greenhouse gases move through the system over time. The computer runs these calculations under different scenarios, such as low or high greenhouse gas emissions, and produces outputs including projected temperature rise, sea level change, rainfall patterns, Arctic sea ice extent, and the frequency of extreme events like floods, droughts, and heat waves. Climate models also integrate interactions among the atmosphere, oceans, cryosphere, land surface, and biosphere because these components continuously exchange energy, water, and gases. For example, increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide can warm the oceans, accelerate glacier melting, and raise sea levels. These predictions help governments design mitigation strategies to reduce emissions, develop adaptation plans for future climate risks, and make informed environmental policy decisions for a more sustainable future. A population model is a simplified representation that helps scientists understand how populations change over time and predict their future dynamics. The process begins by collecting input data about the population and its environment. Key variables include population size, birth rate, death rate, and carrying capacity, the maximum population an environment can sustainably support. These variables are represented mathematically using equations such as the logistic growth model, which describes how population growth slows as resources become limited. The model is then run on a computer to test different scenarios, such as changes in birth rates or carrying capacity, and it produces projections of population size over time. The example of a deer population in a forest demonstrates this concept. Factors such as food availability, space, disease, and predation influence how many deer the habitat can support. Model outputs show that increasing the carrying capacity results in a larger stable population, while a higher growth rate allows the population to reach that level more quickly. Conversely, if food becomes scarce or disease increases, the carrying capacity or growth rate declines, causing the population to stabilize at a lower level. These models help wildlife managers make sustainable decisions about habitat conservation and species management. Human population projections are predictive models that estimate how the global population may change in the future. These models begin by collecting data on current population size, birth rates, death rates, migration, and age structure. Scientists then select an appropriate mathematical model, such as exponential, logistic, or cohort component models, depending on the purpose of the study. Next, assumptions are made about future fertility, mortality, migration, and social, economic, or environmental conditions. The model is then run to project population changes over decades, and the results are analyzed under different scenarios. For example, the United Nations develops low, medium, and high fertility projections to explore a range of possible futures. The examples illustrate that exponential growth assumes unlimited increase, while logistic growth levels off as environmental limits are reached. Different assumptions produce different population trajectories, demonstrating that small changes in fertility or mortality can lead to large differences over time. These projections help governments anticipate future demands for food, water, healthcare, housing, and education, identify potential risks such as aging populations or resource shortages, and support sustainable development planning. Every environmental system is made up of interconnected components, and the interactions among them determine how the system functions and changes over time. Consider an ecosystem as an example. Sunlight provides energy to plants, plants provide food for animals, and decomposers return nutrients to the soil, allowing plants to grow again. These interactions create continuous cycles and feedback loops. Some interactions increase a process, some reduce it, while others involve mutual influence or complete feedback cycles. Feedback loops are especially important. Positive feedback amplifies change. For example, rising temperatures melt ice, reducing Earth's albedo, so more solar energy is absorbed, leading to even greater warming. In contrast, negative feedback stabilizes a system. A familiar example is thermoregulation in humans. When body temperature rises, sweating increases heat loss, returning temperature toward its normal range. These principles apply across many systems. In the climate system, greenhouse gases, ice cover, and albedo interact to influence global temperature. In food webs, changes in one species affect many others. In the human body, physiological responses maintain homeostasis. Understanding these interactions helps us predict how environmental systems respond to both natural and human-induced changes. Emergent properties are new patterns or behaviors that arise from the interactions among system components rather than from any single component alone. A classic example is the predator-prey cycle. When prey, such as rabbits, become abundant, predators like lynx have more food available, allowing their population to increase. As predator numbers grow, predation intensifies, causing the prey population to decline. With fewer prey available, predators experience food shortages, so their population also decreases. As predator numbers fall, hunting pressure is reduced, enabling the prey population to recover. This sequence repeats continuously, producing regular population oscillations over time. The graphs and data table illustrate that prey populations typically increase first, followed by predator populations after a short time lag. Importantly, these repeating cycles are an emergent property of the entire ecosystem. Neither predators nor prey display this pattern independently, it emerges only through their continuous interaction. Similar emergent behaviors occur in many environmental systems, including disease outbreaks, forest succession, and nutrient cycling, where interactions among components generate system-level patterns that cannot be understood by studying individual parts in isolation. Emergent properties arise when interactions among system components produce outcomes that cannot be explained by studying each component separately. A classic ecological example is a trophic cascade involving predators, herbivores, and plants. When predator populations, such as wolves, are healthy, they regulate herbivores like elk, allowing vegetation such as willows to flourish. If predator numbers decline because of hunting or habitat loss, herbivore populations increase and consume more vegetation. As plant cover decreases, riverbanks become unstable, erosion increases, and habitats for many other organisms are degraded. These ecosystem-wide changes affect birds, beavers, fish, and numerous other species, demonstrating that a small change at one trophic level can trigger widespread ecological consequences. The Yellowstone National Park case study illustrates this process clearly. After wolves were reintroduced in 1995, elk numbers and grazing pressure declined, vegetation recovered, riverbanks stabilized, beavers returned, fish habitats improved, and biodiversity increased. This sequence demonstrates that a trophic cascade is an emergent property of the ecosystem, resulting from interactions among multiple species rather than the actions of any single organism alone. Now, consider the concept of ecosystem resilience, which refers to an ecosystem's ability to absorb disturbances, adapt to change, and recover while maintaining its essential structure and functions. A healthy ecosystem, with high biodiversity and strong interactions among species, is generally more stable. When a disturbance such as a wildfire, drought, pollution event, or severe storm occurs, the ecosystem does not necessarily collapse. Instead, it uses its biodiversity, available resources, and ecological interactions to resist damage and adapt. Over time, ecological processes such as succession allow vegetation and wildlife to recover, restoring the ecosystem to a similar functional state. Several factors strengthen resilience, including high biodiversity, complex food webs, habitat diversity, functional redundancy, where different species perform similar ecological roles, and natural processes like nutrient cycling and seed dispersal. For example, after a forest fire, seeds stored in the soil and surviving organisms help regenerate the forest. The comparison between high and low resilience illustrates that ecosystems with greater biodiversity recover quickly after disturbance, whereas ecosystems with low biodiversity recover slowly, lose key functions, or may even shift permanently to a different ecological state. This highlights why conserving biodiversity is essential for maintaining resilient ecosystems in a changing world. To understand ecosystem resilience, consider how different ecosystems recover after disturbances. A coral reef exposed to heat stress may undergo bleaching, but if temperatures return to normal and local stressors such as pollution are reduced, corals can regrow and the reef can gradually recover. Similarly, after a forest wildfire, surviving seeds, roots, and soil microorganisms enable vegetation to regenerate through ecological succession. A wetland affected by drought often recovers when rainfall returns, allowing aquatic plants and wildlife to re-establish. In grasslands, even after heavy grazing by livestock or wild herbivores, grasses frequently regrow from underground roots and seeds, restoring plant cover and stabilizing the soil. A stream polluted by waste can also recover when pollution sources are removed, as clean water returns and aquatic organisms recolonize the habitat. These examples demonstrate that resilience depends on biodiversity, natural regeneration processes, and suitable environmental conditions. Consider how a grassland ecosystem demonstrates resilience following grazing. Before grazing, the ecosystem supports tall grasses, diverse plant species, insects, birds, and grazing mammals, creating a stable and productive habitat. When cattle or other herbivores graze, plant biomass decreases, representing a natural disturbance. However, in a resilient grassland, the underground root systems, seeds, and soil microorganisms remain largely intact, allowing the ecosystem to absorb the disturbance. Recovery begins as grasses regenerate from their roots and dormant seeds, producing new shoots and gradually restoring plant cover. Over time, the grassland returns to a condition similar to its original state, maintaining essential ecological functions such as nutrient cycling, soil stability, and habitat provision. For example, rotational grazing on well-managed rangelands allows vegetation sufficient time to recover between grazing periods. Resilience is strengthened by factors such as high plant diversity, deep and healthy root systems, fertile soils, moderate grazing intensity, and landscape heterogeneity. The comparison between high and low resilience shows that resilient grasslands recover rapidly after grazing, whereas degraded grasslands recover slowly, lose productivity, and may eventually shift to shrubland or barren land if overgrazing continues. A forest recovering after a wildfire provides an excellent example of ecosystem resilience. Before the fire, the forest supports diverse plant and animal species, multiple vegetation layers, and complex ecological interactions. When a wildfire occurs, vegetation is burned, some plants and animals are lost, and habitat conditions change dramatically. However, the ecosystem is not completely destroyed. Although many trees are damaged, seeds stored in the soil or cones, underground roots, beneficial microorganisms, and surviving wildlife remain, providing the foundation for recovery. As conditions improve, pioneer species colonize the burned area, seeds germinate, and young plants establish, gradually restoring food, shelter, and ecosystem functions. Over time, shrubs and trees mature, biodiversity increases, and the forest returns to a healthy state similar to its original condition. For example, many pine species release seeds only after exposure to intense heat, enabling rapid regeneration following fire. Forest resilience is strengthened by high biodiversity, fire-adapted species, healthy soils, varied forest structure, and connections to nearby unburned areas that provide seeds and returning wildlife. The resilience graph illustrates that although ecosystem condition declines immediately after the disturbance, a resilient forest gradually recovers while maintaining its essential ecological processes. Next, consider how diversity and the size of storages influence the resilience of environmental systems. Greater diversity, whether of species, genes, or ecological functions, provides multiple pathways for a system to continue operating when disturbances occur. In a low-diversity ecosystem, such as a monoculture crop field, a single disease or drought may affect nearly all organisms. By contrast, a diverse grassland or forest contains species with different tolerances, so while some may decline, others survive and maintain essential ecosystem functions. The size of system storages also affects how quickly a system responds to change. Small storages lead to rapid responses with short time lags, whereas large storages buffer disturbances and create longer time lags, allowing more time for adaptation. For example, a small pond may heat up quickly during a heat wave, while a deep lake changes temperature much more slowly. Similarly, large carbon stores in forests or soils, groundwater aquifers, nutrient-rich soils, and biomass act as buffers against sudden environmental change. The key message is that ecosystems with high biodiversity and large storages are generally more resilient because they can absorb disturbances, respond more gradually, and reduce the risk of abrupt or irreversible changes. This case study demonstrates how biodiversity and storage capacity influence ecosystem resilience. A natural North American prairie is highly resilient because it contains many plant species, insects, birds, and soil organisms. Its deep and diverse root systems store large amounts of water and carbon, improve soil structure, and promote efficient nutrient cycling. These features enable the prairie to withstand disturbances such as drought, pest outbreaks, and climate variability while continuing to function. When these diverse grasslands are replaced by monoculture crop systems, resilience declines significantly. A single crop species provides little biological diversity, shallow root systems store less water and carbon, and nutrients are lost more easily. As a result, the system becomes more vulnerable to drought, pests, diseases, and extreme weather. For example, a pest outbreak in a maize monoculture can spread rapidly because every plant is equally susceptible. The consequences include soil degradation, declining productivity, poorer water infiltration with increased runoff, and reduced carbon storage, leading to higher greenhouse gas emissions. This example highlights an important S principle: replacing diverse natural ecosystems with monocultures reduces resilience and increases vulnerability to environmental change. This example illustrates how the size of a storage influences the resilience of a system. Consider a small puddle. Because it contains very little water, it heats and cools rapidly as air temperature changes. It also loses water quickly through evaporation during hot or windy weather, provides very little buffering against disturbance, and can dry out completely within a few days. As a result, puddles are relatively unstable and less resilient. Now compare this with a large lake. Its much greater water volume changes temperature slowly, evaporates more gradually, and acts as a strong buffer against environmental fluctuations. Even during a short heat wave, a lake usually maintains suitable conditions for aquatic organisms. For example, fish are far more likely to survive in a lake than in a shallow puddle during periods of extreme heat. The key principle is that larger storages absorb change more effectively, creating time lags that give ecosystems more time to respond and recover. Consequently, large storages promote greater stability and resilience, whereas small storages respond rapidly and are much more vulnerable to environmental change. Now, consider how human activities influence the resilience of environmental systems. Humans reduce storage capacity through activities such as deforestation, which removes biomass and stored carbon, dam construction and excessive water extraction, which decrease water stored in rivers and aquifers, urbanization, which replaces permeable soil with concrete, and overharvesting, which reduces biomass in natural populations. Humans also reduce biodiversity through monoculture farming, pesticide use, invasive species, and habitat loss or fragmentation. For example, replacing a diverse forest with a single crop plantation greatly reduces species diversity and ecosystem stability. These changes reduce a system's ability to buffer disturbances, shorten the time available to respond, slow recovery after events such as droughts or floods, and increase the likelihood of crossing ecological tipping points. The overall result is lower resilience, meaning ecosystems become less able to absorb disturbances, adapt to environmental change, and recover while maintaining their essential structure and functions. This is why conserving both biodiversity and natural storages is fundamental to sustainable environmental management. Consider how deforestation reduces the resilience of a forest ecosystem. A healthy forest has high biodiversity, large carbon, water, and nutrient storages, and a strong buffering capacity that helps it resist droughts, floods, and temperature extremes. Because of these large storages, environmental changes occur gradually, giving the ecosystem time to adapt and recover. Human activities such as logging, agricultural expansion, mining, road construction, and burning forests remove vegetation and release stored carbon. Converting forests into pasture or monoculture plantations also reduces biodiversity and compacts exposed soils. As a result, the ecosystem loses stored carbon, water, and nutrients, buffering capacity becomes weaker, and the system responds more rapidly to disturbances. The consequences are greater vulnerability to drought, increased flood risk, soil degradation, reduced carbon storage, and slower recovery after disturbance. For example, parts of the Amazon rainforest that have experienced extensive deforestation now recover more slowly from drought and fire. The key message is that deforestation reduces both biodiversity and storage capacity, causing ecosystem resilience to decline and increasing the risk of long-term ecosystem degradation. Now, let's apply systems thinking to a real-world example, a compost ecosystem. A compost heap is a dynamic system where biotic components, such as decomposers, consumers, and plants, interact continuously with abiotic factors, including light, water, nutrients, oxygen, and temperature. Organic waste enters the system, microorganisms and earthworms break it down, nutrients are recycled, water and gases move through the compost, and the final output is nutrient-rich compost that supports plant growth. This activity also demonstrates how changing one variable affects the entire system. For example, removing earthworms slows decomposition, reduces aeration, and produces lower quality compost. Maintaining a balanced carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 25:31 keeps decomposition rapid, whereas excess carbon slows microbial activity. Similarly, optimal moisture levels of 50–60% support active microbes, while compost that is too dry or too wet decomposes more slowly. This investigation highlights the interconnected nature of environmental systems and demonstrates how interactions between living organisms and abiotic factors determine ecosystem function and resilience. Next, let's explore a bottle ecosystem, a simple model that demonstrates how living and non-living components interact within a closed system. The bottle contains producers such as plants, decomposers like bacteria and fungi, soil, water, air, and drainage materials. Sunlight provides the energy for photosynthesis, while water continuously evaporates, condenses, and returns to the soil, illustrating the water cycle. Within the system, plants absorb carbon dioxide and release oxygen, while organisms and microorganisms respire, decompose organic matter, and recycle nutrients back into the soil. We can investigate how changing one variable influences the entire ecosystem. For example, removing snails alters gas exchange and biomass production, different water levels affect plant growth and condensation, and nutrient availability influences leaf color, biomass, and organism abundance. Throughout the investigation, variables such as temperature, light intensity, pH, plant height, biomass, condensation, and organism numbers can be measured. This activity demonstrates the fundamental ESS concepts of interdependence, nutrient cycling, energy flow, and system balance, showing that even a small change in one component can affect the functioning of the whole ecosystem. Now, let's investigate an aquarium ecosystem, which serves as an excellent model of a closed aquatic system. The aquarium contains producers such as aquatic plants, consumers including fish and snails, decomposers like bacteria and fungi, along with water, rocks, gravel, air, and light. Sunlight provides energy for photosynthesis. Plants absorb carbon dioxide and release oxygen, animals respire and produce waste, and decomposers recycle nutrients back into the water, maintaining continuous matter cycling. This model also allows us to explore how changing individual variables affects the entire system. For example, removing aquatic plants lowers dissolved oxygen, increases carbon dioxide and nitrate levels, reduces water clarity, and decreases fish activity. Similarly, excessive nitrate concentrations or overfeeding stimulate algal blooms, reduce oxygen availability, and negatively affect fish health. During the investigation, we can measure variables such as water temperature, pH, dissolved oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrate, phosphate, ammonia, water hardness, plant biomass, fish biomass, and water clarity. This activity clearly demonstrates the S principles of energy flow, nutrient cycling, interdependence, and system balance, showing how changes in one component influence the stability and resilience of the entire ecosystem. Now, let's explore a terrarium ecosystem, a self-contained model that demonstrates how living organisms interact with their physical environment. Producers such as mosses, ferns, and small plants capture light energy through photosynthesis, while consumers and detritivores, including isopods and springtails, feed on organic matter. Decomposers such as fungi and bacteria break down dead material, releasing nutrients that are recycled to support new plant growth. Water continuously evaporates, condenses on the container, and returns to the soil, while carbon dioxide and oxygen cycle between organisms. This investigation also shows how changing one variable influences the entire ecosystem. For example, removing isopods slows leaf litter decomposition, increases fungal growth, and reduces nutrient availability. Excess nutrients can cause fungal overgrowth and imbalance, while soil that is too dry or too wet stresses plants and disrupts ecosystem stability. By comparing these conditions, students observe how interactions among organisms, water, and nutrients determine the health and resilience of the terrarium. This activity reinforces the concepts of energy flow, nutrient cycling, interdependence, and system balance within a closed ecosystem. This slide presents the Section A assessment pattern in IB ESS exam. The questions assess your understanding of key concepts. Read each question carefully, identify the most appropriate answer, and record the correct option A, B, C, or D on your answer sheet. These questions evaluate both conceptual understanding and the application of ESS principles to real-world environmental situations. This slide outlines Section B of the IB ESS assessment. The questions assess your understanding of key concepts. Answer every question using clear scientific terminology, concise explanations, and, where appropriate, support your responses with relevant environmental examples to maximize your marks. This slide presents Section C, the data-based questions. You are provided with a graph showing ecosystem condition following a wildfire and a supporting data table. The questions assess your ability to identify the disturbance, perform simple calculations, interpret recovery trends. Success in this section depends on combining graph analysis, data interpretation, and ESS knowledge to justify your answers with clear scientific reasoning. This slide introduces Section D, the structured questions. You are required to answer one question only. The first option focuses on explaining negative and positive feedback mechanisms and discussing how biodiversity enhances ecosystem resilience. The second option requires a comparative analysis of a natural prairie ecosystem and a monoculture crop system, considering biodiversity, nutrient cycling, soil health, resilience to disturbance, and carbon storage. In this section, marks are awarded for well-structured explanations, scientific terminology, logical comparisons, and the use of relevant environmental examples. This slide presents Section E, the extended response or essay section. You must answer one of the 3 essay questions. The topics focus on the relationship between biodiversity and resilience, the influence of positive and negative feedback mechanisms on ecosystem resilience and sustainability, and the factors affecting resilience using wildfire recovery and prairie ecosystems as examples. To achieve high marks, organize your essay with a clear introduction, well-developed scientific arguments, relevant ecological examples or case studies, and a balanced conclusion supported by appropriate ESS concepts.